Configurations can be used to quickly create new versions of a part or an assembly without having to recreate the geometry in a new part or having to save as into a new part. To create a new configuration, we can go into the Configuration tab, right-click on the Configurations, and go to Add Configuration. In this case, we'll create a configuration called No Shell. Now we have two identical configurations, our no shell configuration and our default configuration. The reason they are identical is that when you create a new configuration, it creates a copy of the active configuration. Now if I go back into the no shell, just by double clicking on it, and back into the feature manager, I'm going to go ahead and right click on shell and choose to suppress it. Now if we go back to the Configurations tab, we can see what the result of this is. If you go back into the default, you can see that it still has the shell active. And if we go back into the no shell configuration, we can see that it's suppressed. Configurations in parts can be used with both features as well as dimensions. If I go back into the feature tree, I can update a dimension. For example, if I click on this face, it'll bring up several of the dimensions. I'm going to go ahead and modify the diameter of these holes. I'll just double click on this and change that dimension to 3/8 of an inch. But before I do that, once you do go ahead and add in multiple configurations, you'll find that the dimension property manager here now has this option of configurations. And by default, it's set to all configurations. So if I modify this dimension, it's going to update any configurations that I have. To update only this configuration, I'll click the pull down and choose this configuration. I could also specify configurations if I wanted this dimension to apply to multiple configurations. And I'll hit the rebuild button to apply that change. And now if we take a look at our default versus our no shell, we'll see the difference. This error message might come up, rebuild this document. Click on Don't Ask Me Again and choose to rebuild. We do want the part to rebuild each time we change configurations. That'll make it a lot easier to see what changes we have made. You'll also want to note that how you create your sketches makes a huge difference on how quickly you can create the configurations that you want. For example, here, if I right click on the face and choose to edit the sketch, you can see that I only have a dimension applied to one of these holes. They're all set with an equal relation, and there's only one spacing dimension. That's because these are all coincident to these center lines, and they're either vertical of each other when necessary or horizontal of each other when necessary. And this allows all four of these holes to update together. In terms of creating configurations, your design intent, such as keeping these holes the same size and positioned uniformly around this rectangle, are going to be important in being able to quickly and efficiently create configurations. The Configurations Manager also has an option called Derived Configuration. These can be created by right-clicking on the configuration itself and choosing Add Derived Configuration. And in this case, we'll choose to name this No Shell Smaller. And we see it comes in as active with the same feature set as the No Shell configuration. And the way a derived configuration works is that it views this as a parent-child relationship. Any changes made to the no shell will apply to the no shell smaller here. I tend, however, not to use derived configurations very often. The reason for this is once you update a dimension or update a feature on the derived configuration side of it, it'll break the link between, for example, this dimension and the main configuration. One thing to keep in mind with the derived configuration is that while changing dimensions allows you to keep this linked to the parent configuration, suppressing out a feature won't link back to that parent configuration. So once I suppress, for example, this boss extrude 4 in the derived configuration, that's no longer going to be linked to the no shell configuration. Just to show how that works, if I suppress the boss extrude 4 here and unsuppress it here along with the fillet, it won't change those features back. So keep in mind, just once again with derived configurations, once those feature suppression states or unsuppression states are changed, that'll break the link between the parent and child just on the feature level. And if you do end up wanting to change a dimension just in the derived configuration, you can also do that by just changing this back to this configuration. And we can update this to 3 inches. And we can see now that that dimension is no longer linked. Configurations can also be created directly from a feature or directly from a dimension. This can be done by right-clicking on a feature and going to Configure Feature. From here you can control the suppression state as well as create new configurations. In this case we will choose to create 2 new configurations, larger and no shell larger. And just click in this box to add the configuration. And you can apply those changes without actually changing any of the suppression states there. If we go back into the Configurations tab, if we look at no shell larger and larger, you can see that they're both based on what the last active configuration was, which was this no shell smaller, the derived configuration. And now we can go ahead and update some dimensions here. I'm going to double click on the width and I'll choose to specify the configurations. We'll choose larger and no shell larger as well. And click OK. And I'm going to update this to 5 inches. I'm also going to update the width. We'll also specify configuration there, larger and no shell larger. And I'll update this to 3 inches and rebuild. And exit out of that. And then we'll go back into the feature manager and right click on the shell feature and choose configure feature. In this case we want it to be unsuppressed in the larger configuration and suppressed in the no shell larger. So we'll go ahead and apply that and click OK. You'll also want to keep in mind the parent-child relationship between any of your features, because if you were wanting, for example, to suppress this fillet as well as this extrusion, all you have to do is suppress the boss extrude 4 because the fillet 1 is a child of the boss extrude 4. If I right-click on extrude 1 and go to configure feature, I'll go ahead and create another configuration and call it empty. And I'll choose to suppress that boss extrude 1 and apply the change. Now if we open up that empty configuration, we can see that it suppresses all of the features because they're all children of that boss extrude 1. I'll go ahead and activate the default configuration again. And if you right click on a dimension now You can also configure the dimension just like we were configuring features. Lastly, when you create a new configuration from the configuration manager, you have an option at the bottom called suppress features. This suppresses any new features added in other configurations. So if I uncheck this, and I'll go ahead and call this unsuppressed, if I go into that default configuration, create a sketch on this face, and then create an extrusion using Instant 3D here, that'll be suppressed in our other configurations, but it'll come in as unsuppressed in the new unsuppressed configuration. Personally, I tend to keep the suppress features box checked. It keeps the suppressed configurations from becoming messy when you add new features to a single configuration. Lastly, a mistake that's commonly made with configurations is that someone will create a new configuration and then decide that they want to delete out a feature in a certain configuration. This will delete the feature from all of the configurations. Instead of deleting it, make sure you are suppressing the feature.